Okay, so welcome everyone to the last talk of the Clea group for the year of 2020. It's been a busy year, plenty of great talks, and it's a pleasure to welcome here Pierre Steiner, a longtime friend from the Université de Technologie de Compiègne. He's going to talk about radical views of cognition and the dynamics of scientific change. And then we'll have comments by Celso Neto, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Dalhousie University. Pierre is going to talk for about 45 minutes, right, Pierre?
Yes.
And then we shall have 20 minutes for comments by Celso, and then we open the Q&A. Thank you, everyone. Pierre, please, you have the word.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Andre, for the presentation and also for the invitation. Thank you, everybody, for thinking about me. I'm very happy to meet you and to be part of your research activities. So indeed, the title of my talk today is the same as the title of a paper that was recently published in a special issue of Synthèse, a special issue that was edited by Marco Silva, with here as well. So I'm very happy to meet him finally with this on this occasion. So here is the outline of my talk. I will briefly remind you or present you a look at what some people call the war field of the foundations of cognitive science, and more specifically two debates. First, the debate between representationalism and anti-representationalism, and secondly, the debate between vehicular internalism and vehicular externalism in the definition of cognitive processes. Then I will focus on what I call, with other people, radical views of cognition, which very often use a Kuhnian terminology for defining themselves and what they do in the landscape of cognitive science today. Then in the third part, I'll try to see if, well, the use of the Kuhnian vocabulary, and especially the use of the Kuhnian notion of revolution, is appropriate. And in the fourth part, I will try to argue that, well, the Kuhnian use is not very justified, but that doesn't mean they are not revolutionary. But those views can be revolutionary if, for instance, we endorse another theory of scientific change, namely a theory proposed by Larry Loden, the theories of research traditions. So I start with a look at the war field of the foundations of cognitive science. I'll start from with a quote from a paper by the philosopher of science and cognition, Fred Adams, who spoke recently about Cognition Wars. And he said, I quote, "In case you missed it, there is a war going on over what counts as cognition. Luckily, it is a war among academics, so likely no one will get hurt. But it's a war nonetheless. It started with challenges to the traditional conception of human cognition, ordering that cognition takes place in the brain after perception and before motor processing." So Adam says, and it's not very new, that, well, there is an increasing number of theories of cognition which are refusing the idea that cognition only takes place in the brain between perception and action. And on the other hand, there is also what is called in other papers as so-called representation wars. That is, this is the idea to know if we should continue to use the concept of mental representations when we try to define, to describe, and to explain cognitive processes. And those are different debates. They are orthogonal, but of course they can be combined. And indeed, if we take the history of cognitive science, I think it's very justified to say that the first theory of cognition, as known today, namely the theory of computation, relied on the one hand on the idea that the vehicles of cognition takes only place in the brain. Well, they are not identical with brain states. They are functional states with syntactic properties. Well, they are realized in material properties of the brain, but still they have some levels of autonomy in the study and description. And those states, well, they are symbols, they are mental representations of the world. They are caused by appropriate relations between organism and the environment. And of course, from the 1980s, there has been a heated debate between, on the one hand, proponents of classical computation, and here, of course, the main name is Jerry Fodor, and proponents of other approaches, arguing that, well, the vehicles of cognition remain in the brain indeed, but they are not symbols. They are more like assemblies of neurons, neural networks, which do not have formal or syntactical properties similar to the one of symbols. So this was an important debate, but the debate relied on two assumptions that were not questions. First, the idea that cognition remains in the brain, and the idea that, well, cognition still remains representational. There have been in the 1990s some attempts by neuroscientists, I'm thinking here about Walter Freeman and Christina Sciarda, to argue that, well, the concept of meta representation was not appropriate for defining and modelizing and predicting what happened in the brain where there is cognition. So here, this is an example of people, well, this is a quite a minority, but it's a logical possible view that's saying that, well, cognition remains in the brain. It is internal, but we do not need the concept of representation for defining and studying it. And it's important to know that it was a part of the classical project of cognitive science that, well, cognition should remain confined in the brain, because, well, otherwise its study would become much more complex and actually impossible. And here, this is a quote from a book by Howard Gardner, a classical book, The Mind, New Science, and a History of the Cognitive Revolutions. Gardner wrote, though mainstream cognitive scientists do not necessarily bear any animus against the affective realm, against the context that surrounds any action or thought, or against historical and cultural analysis, in practice, they attempt to factor all these elements to the maximum extent possible. This may be a question of practicality. If one were to take into account all these individualizing and phenomenalistic elements, cognitive science might become, he says, impossible. In an effort to explain everything, one ends up explaining nothing. So this is, I think, a very important reason that was put forward at that time by Gardner for justifying the fact that, well, cognition should remain an internal process. And so from the 1990s, different theories of cognition, called under various names like situated cognition, distributed cognition, or embodied cognitions, started to question the assumption that the vehicles of cognitions should remain in the brain or in the head. And here I'm thinking about the classical work by Andy Clark, the Clark and Chalmers paper, The Extended Mind, works also by David Kirsch, by Ed Hutchins, Mark Rowlands. All those people were arguing against vehicular internalism, but very often, and Andy Clark is a very good example, they did not give up the concept of meta representations. For them, well, cognition was representational, but it should not be defined in terms of representation, but the concept kept its explanatory importance. But representations should be put in relation with action and with the environment in terms of technical environment, biological environment, or with the body, for instance. And so, and it's important because, for instance, Clark never considered that extended cognition was in opposition with computation. He just said that no, those two theories, they are complementary. He even said in his one of his last books, Surfing Certainty, that actually you could use the model of computation for describing and modeling, well, extended cognition. It's totally possible. It's even necessary. And finally, from the middle of the 1990s, other theories appeared under various names, like, and here I would just say, I just take some examples, like inaction and enactivism, ecological theories consisting in the rediscovery of the work of Gibson, or dynamical systems theory applied to cognition, that put into question both vehicular externalism but also the representationist assumptions of classical cognitive science, but also of embodied, situated, or extended cognition. Sorry, I mentioned some names, but of course, the list is not exhaustive. Francisco Varela, Thompson and Roche, Sean Gallagher, Ezequiel Di Paolo with autopoietic enactivism, Dan Hutto and Eric Main in their radical enactivism, Anthony Kimiro with his radical embodied cognitive science, or even Alva Noé, even though Noé is, I think, as a specific position on this in this field. And it's important to note that if we take those authors, the names of their book very often use the term radical. For instance, Hutto and Main, radicalizing enactivism, or Kimiro, radical embodied cognitive science. So they are very ambitious in their attempt to define a new science of the mind by refusing both representationism, but also vehicle internalism. And so what I call here radical views of cognition are those views, and those views only. So those views, I define them as follow. They claim being opposed to classical and contemporary views of cognition on the following issues. First, the localization of the vehicles of cognition. They argue that those vehicles can be internal, but very often they consist in an interaction or in a crisscrossing between the world, the body, and the brain. They are very skeptical. They refuse, they criticize the explanatory and not only the analytical endorsement of representationism. That is, they do not only say mental representation does not exist, they say, well, we do not even need the concept, even in an instrumentalist fashion, for understanding and explaining cognition. And they insist that, well, this change of perspective introduces new methods and new issues that matter for cognitive science. For instance, in autopoietic enactivism, well, a cognitive science, well, should be also a science of life, since, well, if we define cognition as being equal to life, well, an understanding of living systems should matter for cognitive science. And of course, living systems are much more than the brain. And indeed, for many living systems, you do not need a brain to be living, and you don't need a brain to be cognitive. And also, they often use a Kuhnian vocabulary for defining what they do. So this is the second part, the use of the Kuhnian terminology for defining themselves. I'm giving some examples. At the beginning of their book called In Action, Toward a New Paradigm for Cognitive Science, and of course, the concept of paradigm is a Kuhnian concept, the authors, my former colleagues, John Stewart, Gapen, and also Di Paolo, write, this program, In Action, makes a radical break with the formalisms of information processing and symbolic representations prevalent in cognitive science. Instead, cognition is grounded in the sensory motor dynamics of the interactions between a living organism and its environment. So here, I put the emphasis on the use of the concept paradigm and of the idea that there is a radical break. In 2016, a book edited by Andreas Engel, a neuroscientist, called The Pragmatic Turn Towards Action-Oriented Views in Cognitive Science. In the preface of the book, you may read, in cognitive science, I quote, we are currently witnessing a pragmatic turn away from the traditional representation-centered framework towards a paradigm that focuses on understanding cognition as inactive, as skillful activity that involves ongoing interaction with the external world. So here too, there is the idea that there is a radical break, and it is a change of paradigm. And finally, the linguist Raymond Gibbs in 2006 is writing in his book Embodiment and Cognitive Science. He says, we are in the midst of a major scientific revolution, properly described as a paradigm shift in the study and understanding of the human mind. After decades of research and theory into the underlying ways that human cognition is related to disembodied computational processes, cognitive scientists in the past 10 years have altered their focus for studying the mind as being inherently embodied. So those are some examples of the use, once again, of the Kuhnian concept of revolution and paradigm shift. And it's interesting because very recently, two linguists, John Goldsmith and Bernard Lax, have published a book called Battle in the Minefields, where actually they remark and they make the history of the birth of the sciences of the mind from the beginning of the 19th century, so namely linguistics and psychology, and they remark that in these fields, almost every alleged scientific theory, which considers itself as novel and more scientific than its concurrents, comes with a narrative, with a story. It situates itself in the intellectual landscape and in the history of its discipline, often over-exaggerating the differences and oppositions in a spirit of radicality. So what they show in their book is that, well, the use of a vocabulary like doing a scientific revolution, being totally against some theory, or being finally the only way to do good science, well, is not very novel in the senses of the mind. It's you can find this tendency already from the start. And actually, we could even use the inactive theory of cognition for understanding this tendency. Indeed, a very basic concept in active cognition is the concept of sense making. Sense making for an activist is a property of the coupling between organisms and their environments. In order for organisms to live in the world and to survive and to have needs, values, and so on, it consists in making sense of what happens. And actually, well, scientific agents, they are also living systems. And we could also see some science as being in itself a kind of emanation of these systems. And so every science, every scientific practice, any commitment in science comes for the agents with a story, a narrative, from which you can situate, you can explain, you can justify what you do. And very often, well, those are stories, those are narratives. They are not necessarily true, but they give a sense to your activity. And if indeed you consider yourself as being opposite, as being as doing a scientific revolution, well, it gives sense to your activity, and you believe that what you do is more important than doing something else, for instance. But of course, the question is, well, is there, do the facts correspond with the Kuhnian narrative, with the Kuhnian story, which is used by the main actors? So, is the vocabulary of scientific revolution understood in Thomas Kuhn's sense, which I will define in some moments, appropriate here for characterizing the actual and not only the proclaimed changes made by radical views of cognition? There has been already some work on questioning the very idea of cognitive revolution. That is, as I said before, even independently of the ideas that there might be today a new revolution in cognitive science, the very idea of revolution is at the birth of the classical understanding of the history of cognitive science. And indeed, I've quoted Howard Gardner some minutes ago. Well, Gardner considered that, well, there is the cognitive revolution. The classical received story is that positing information and representation in the brain is a revolution in comparison with behaviorism and with introspectionism. Well, people like George Miller or Theodore Lee have in the past have already questioned this idea that there would have been some revolution from behaviorism to Chomsky, for instance. They show that, well, no, it is much more complicated than that, and that the use of the revolution is not very appropriate. And of course, this idea of questioning today the existence of revolution in cognitive science relies on the presupposition that cognitive science exists on the singular, whereas some people, like recently Nunes and colleagues, have argued that, well, there is not one cognitive science. Cognitive science is increasingly knowing a situation in which there is a fragmentation of research, so that we only have cognitive sciences in the plural, which of course makes much more problematic the use of the concept of paradigm revolution. For instance, Nunes and colleagues have written in 2019, we have the impression that cognitive science has gradually turned its uniform effort into an eclectic group of academic practices that no longer have clear common goals, research questions, or theories. Indeed, they say the label cognitive scientist today is often used as a catch-all designation to label or self-label scholars with a dizzying array of unrelated interests and theoretical orientations. So, of course, this is an important issue, and this is not the issue I will address today, but a possible attitude towards my research, my issue here is to say that, well, forget about cognitive science in the singular. Cognitive science in the singular does not exist anymore. It's dying. There are only cognitive sciences, and it's impossible to find some unity so that we can question the existence of a revolution in cognitive science. So I now pass to the question: can we use the Kuhnian concept for understanding those radical views of cognition and their alleged revolutions? So, just a recipe for revolution following Kuhn. For Kuhn, before becoming a science, a theoretical discipline exists at the level of pre-science. The stage of pre-science is characterized by an abundance of schools that disagree in terms of definitions, methods, or questions when it comes to define their subject matter. The difference between science and pre-science is not a difference of paradigm. For Kuhn, when there is pre-science, there are many paradigms, but this is the problem. In order to have one science and not pre-science, you need to have only one paradigm, which is endorsed by the totality of the scientists. This is the reason, when a set of definitions, principles, methods, and questions receives a universal assent, the work of science begins, and especially normal science. Well, normal science, so this is the stage one, is norm-governed science. It functions within a set of tacit definitions, values, expectations, methods that every scientist has interiorized in virtue of their education. The paradigm defines the rules and the standards of scientific practice and a research agenda. It is a set of conceptual, theoretical, procedural, instrumental, and methodological commitments guiding the members of the scientific community in their daily work of puzzle solving, adjusting or updating models in the light of new phenomena, for instance, refining constants, developing the explanatory scope of accepted hypotheses. So, and this is a work of puzzle solving. Still, for any paradigm, there are some puzzles that cannot be solved and that may become anomalies. So this is the stage 2 of the recipe. When anomalies abound in the paradigm and generate attention and worries, a situation of crisis, or what Kuhn is calling extraordinary science, this is stage 3, appear. There are 3 ways for this stage of crisis to end. The anomalies may finally be solved inside of the classical paradigm. The anomalies can persist for a long time, and they can also be accounted for inside of a new emerging paradigm. This is stage 4. There is the possible emergence of an alternative and its prospects of resolution of the anomalies. In the latter case, if the scientific community progressively migrates towards the new paradigm and its own institution, textbooks, journals, granting agencies, we have a paradigm shift or a scientific revolution. So this is the stage 5. A paradigm is abandoned because an alternate candidate is available to take its place. The new paradigm must resolve important anomalies faced by the previous paradigm, but still, it is totally different. Kuhn is writing, and I quote here the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Scientific revolutions are those non-cumulative developmental episodes in which another paradigm is replaced in whole or in part by an incompatible new one. And I quote too, just because it's a transition between incommensurables, the transition between competing paradigms cannot be made at a time forced by logic and natural experience. like the Gestalt switch, this is a classical example of the duck rabbit, it must occur all at once, or not at all. Sorry, this is a classical schema when you start from pre-science, the first paradigm, knowing a crisis, then a revolution, and you go to another new paradigm, which is for Kuhn incommensurable with the former paradigm. So now, independently of what researchers today say by using the Kuhnian vocabulary of revolutions, one may observe in the contemporary situation of cognitive science an important phenomenon Kuhn associated with the state of crisis or extraordinary science. I am quoting Kuhn here: the proliferation of competing articulations, the willingness to try anything, the expression of explicit discontent, the recourse to philosophy and to debate over fundamentals, all these are symptoms of a transition from normal to extraordinary research. The phenomena in italics, I think, are prevalent in today's cognitive science. True, they are not universal in the community of researchers, but their importance is increasing. Let us first mention the constant rediscoveries and invocations of past philosophers who are turned into precursors, resources, or allies of inactive, embodied, or extended cognitive science. John Dewey, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, the second Wittgenstein, and so on. Consider also the various debates on the borders of cognitive systems, what Fred Adams called Cognition Wars, on the debates on the relations between perception and action, or the debates around the dispensability of mental representations. Those are foundational debates leading to wars, and so they are important today. Another phenomenon that might justify a Kuhnian reading of the situation today is the fact that the proponents of the classical theory of cognition and the proponents of radical views of cognition do not only disagree about the theoretical and methodological commitments one should adopt in the study of cognition. More fundamentally, they tend to misrepresent and to misunderstand each other. They downplay their respective scopes and scientific character, or exaggerate their respective weak points. Each community develops and defends a triumphalist self-interpretation of its scientific status. Let me take some examples. First, the theory of computation and radical views of cognition diverge on the importance that should be allocated to some questions or to some anomalies. Take, for instance, the symbol grounding problem, the art problem of consciousness, the issue of proposing a theory of semantic contents, or the problem of the causal efficiency of semantic properties. Radical views of cognitions will see this issue as fatal problems or anomalies in the computational paradigm. Anomalies that justify that computation is in a state of crisis. But for proponents of computations, these issues have been solved a long time ago, or they are solvable. And radical views of cognitions are accused of having a very narrow view of what the computational paradigm is, confusing the paradigm with some of its narrow and very specific versions. And in return, the proponents of computation can accuse radical views of being insufficiently structured for constituting a real scientific alternative to computation. Where are the achievements, the models, the problem-solving abilities, or the exemplars that guide future scientists in this new paradigm? The proponents of computations may consider that radical views of cognition do not propose a new model or theoretic apparatus for explaining cognition. This would be assuming that computation and radical views are competing theories of the same things. But for computations, radical views do not study cognition anymore. They study cognitive processes as types of behavioral processes. So the differences between the two theories are huge. They are very wide. And so this is also some things which fit with what Kuhn said For instance, here, the proponents of competing paradigms will often disagree about the list of problems that any candidate for paradigm must resolve. Their standards or the definitions of science are not the same. And indeed, it's a very common accusation we can find in proponents of computation. They say very often about enactivists, well, they are very sympathetic, but they do not study cognition anymore. So all in all, and also there's all in all, these theoretical differences between computationalism and radical views of cognitions are radical indeed, and seem to fit well with Kuhn's characterization of the differences between successive paradigms. Kuhn writes, successive paradigms tell us different things about the population of the universe and about the population's behavior. But paradigms differ in more than some sense, for they are directed not only to nature, but also to the science that possesses them. They are the sources of the methods, problem field, and standards of solution accepted by any mature scientific community at any given time. As a result, the reception of a new paradigm often necessitates a redefinition of the corresponding science. Some old problems, like for instance today, the hard problem of consciousness, may be relegated to another science or declared entirely unscientific. Others that were previously non-existent or trivial may, with a new paradigm, become the very new archetypes of significant scientific achievement. And as the problem changes, so often does the standard that distinguishes a real scientific solution from a mere metaphysical speculation, word game, or mathematical play. So now that we've seen that there are some elements in today's situations which seems to correspond to a situation of extraordinary science, and there are also some elements which seem to fit with a description of paradigm shift, we must further inquire if this is really a scientific revolution. Are these differences between paradigms? Once again, if we stick to Kuhn's picture, that would lead us to accept that if there is a revolution, this implies that computation is currently fading out to the benefit of a new rising paradigm. But extraordinary research and new claims are not sufficient for making a scientific revolutions. You also need a state of crisis and the migration of the scientific community to a new paradigm. And even though proponents of radical view cognition talk a lot about the revolutions, I believe that the current situations, debates, fundamental misunderstandings, proliferation of new theories is now made of elements that would directly imply in Kuhn's frameworks the existence of a revolution or even maybe of a crisis. Well, the problem with revolutionary claims is twofold. First, those claims of revolutions are neither necessary nor sufficient for bringing about a real revolution. Claiming that there is no a revolution in the making does not imply that a revolution actually occurs. More broadly, the history of science is full of examples where thinkers or scientists that consider themselves as orthodox achieved what posterity understood as a scientific revolutions. Take for example, Copernicus. And it is full of examples of self-proclaimed revolutionary theories that have been finally classified as pseudosciences or scientific failures. See, for instance, mesmerism or phrenology. Scientific revolutions, from Kuhn's perspective, are only perceived ex post facto once they are done. It happens that sometimes conceptual and definitional changes can turn out to have very significant empirical differences, but it is also plausible that many more conceptual changes finally turn to be of minor importance. To put it otherwise, I believe it is maybe too early to infer from the discussion and the criticism of computation the idea that there is a crisis, or to infer from the appearance of new theories that there is now a revolution in the making, or a paradigm shift. Let me insist that for Kuhn, scientific revolutions are revolutions in the community, whereby the community favors a new paradigm over another. Well, this is not the case today, where only some individuals and community, including myself, endorse radical views of cognition. Even before the possibility of a revolution, proponents of RVC must not confuse the fact that computation, as any scientific theory, meets problems, puzzles, and anomalies with the idea that it would be in crisis. This is especially important if one does not reduce computation to some of its most popular and discussed versions. It is one thing to say for radical views that computation is wrong, but it is another for proponents of computation themselves to experience the failure or the anomalies of their own paradigm. And I think that, of course, there are many criticisms of computations, but we are still very far from the situation in which proponents of computation themselves would feel very insecure about their own paradigm. So with this judgment, we can say that, well, maybe we might say that there are currently two paradigms in creative science. One classical paradigm, computation, and a new emerging paradigm. The revolution consisting in the emergence of the new paradigm and not in the replacement of the classical one. This kind of situations seems to be present in Kuhn's theory of science. At some point, Kuhn writes that we sometimes can have two paradigms coexisting peacefully in a period of normal science. But Kuhn does not detail the form of this situation. But as we will see later, this plurality of paradigms is accepted and encouraged by other theories of scientific change. But there is another situation in which different paradigms can be present in the same domain for Kuhn, in period of pre-science, characterized by a competitions between different schools. And actually, there are today some readings of cognitive science arguing, and I'm thinking about Don Ross and James Lediman or Tony Kimero. They argue that, well, the situation today in which there is a proliferation of competing paradigms means that, well, cognitive science is still at the level of pre-science, or is returning to the stage of pre-science. They say that, well, in normal science, you do not spend your time, you do not organize conferences or seminars for pretending that you are doing a new paradigm, because everybody agrees on the basis of the science themselves. If there are fundamental troubles and discussions, that means that, well, cognitive science is not a science. It goes back at the level of pre-science. For instance, for Kimero, well, cognitive science is currently an immature field of study characterized by the absence of a new unifying set of conceptual principles and experimental methodologies. If there were a single dominant paradigm, the only arguments in cognitive science would be arguments over matter of facts, and not agreements involving, for instance, appeals to philosophy or to common sense. So if one decided to adopt or to keep a Kuhnian reading of contemporary cognitive science, it is not sure one would end with the idea that there is no a revolution in the making, but rather with a gloss of cognitive science going back at the level of pre-science, or maybe for other authors, going to the stage of post-science. And here I again refer to the recent paper by Nunes called "What Happened to Cognitive Science?" The author say that the assumptions of the computational paradigm were the very assumptions of science. Questioning the hardcore of this program is increasingly questioning the very possibility of cognitive science, so that, well, the demise of cognitive science is not the future of contemporary theoretical debates. It is already actual, and the theoretical debates today are just a way to a posteriori rationalize, justify a practical situation of the fragmentation of cognitive science. So here too, this is a very pessimistic reading of the situation of cognitive science today, which, like Kimiro, Ross, and Ladyman, and myself, is very skeptical about the use of the term paradigm shift. But now I would like, in the fourth part, propose a more optimistic reading of the situation. Well, at least to draw the lines of a possible optimistic reading. That is, fundamentally and independently of what proponents of radical views may say, we can also reject the Kuhnian model because it is a non-appropriate theory of scientific change for several reasons. And the reading of the current situation in cognitive science from Kuhn would be incorrect because Kuhn's theory of science itself would be incorrect or poor. And so this is now what I would like to show with Larry Loden's theory of research traditions. So, like all the philosophers of science writing after Popper, Loden considers that theories, models, experiments, or observations are not the fundamental structures from which scientific inquiry proceeds. The relations between these scientific productions and reality is mediated by the inscription of this production into broader and tacit intellectual structures. And Loden calls them research tradition. And he says, our research tradition is a set of general assumptions about the entities and processes in a domain of study and about the appropriate methods to be used for investigating the problems and constructing the theories in that domain. Examples of research traditions for Loden are the quantum theory, vitalism, Newtonian mechanism, but also behaviorism or psychoanalysis. Research traditions are not theories. They include theories and models, but they also provide guidelines for the development of specific theories. Those guidelines notably consist of an ontology that defines in a general way the types of fundamental entities which exist in the disciplinary domain, which are studied. Interestingly, for Loden, many theories within one research tradition can be mutually inconsistent rivals. Many theories try to improve and correct their predecessors. But still, a number of inconsistent theories can nevertheless endorse the same research tradition. An important difference between Loden's research traditions and Kuhn paradigms is that research traditions evolve not only because the theories they include evolve, but also because some of the more basic core elements evolve. Research traditions and their theories will face anomalies and problems. Very often, these anomalies and problems may be solved by modifying or suppressing specific theories, but they can also be eliminated by modifying parts of the core elements. But most importantly, I think the main difference between Loden's and Kuhn's respective theories of science lies in the possibility and for Loden that different research traditions may coexist at the same time. For any science, Loden claims, two or more research traditions have been the rule rather than the exception. I quote Loden, "It is this perennial coexistence of conflicting traditions of research which makes the focus on revolutionary epochs so misleading. These traditions are constantly evolving. Their relative fortunes may shift through time, or traditions may be largely displaced by new ones. But it is generally unhelpful to focus attention on certain stages of this process as being a revolution and on others as an evolution. The examination of fundamentals, the exploration of alternative frameworks, the replacement of older perspectives by new ones takes place unceasingly in science and in every other disciplines for that matter. So there are changes and debates inside of traditions. There is a coexistence of traditions, but even sometimes continuities. And of course, Loden here is very critical of the reading Kuhn proposed of the history of science and of science. He writes in 1984, sociologists and philosophers of science who predicate their theories of scientific change and cognition on the presumed ambiguity of irresolvable standoffs between monolithic worldviews of the sort that Kuhn describes in his book, run the clear risk of failing to recognize the complex ways in which rival theories typically may share important background assumptions in common. For instance, the assumption of proposing, well, a scientific or mechanistic theory of cognition. But what I focus here are not the continuity, the possible continuities between radical views on cognition and computation. I believe there are many, but rather on the idea that on this model of science and history, well, it is the norm of having different competing research traditions. And so there are for Loudon revolutions in science, but revolutions are not dramatic episodes of replacement of one research tradition by another, but episodes in which a new research tradition emerges as a contender. Loudon writes, a scientific revolution occurs when a research tradition, hitherto unknown to or ignored by scientists in a given field, reaches a point of development where scientists in the field feel obliged to consider it seriously as a contender for the allegiance of themselves or their colleagues. So I believe that if we should stick to the idea that radical views of cognitions are revolutionary, well, maybe it's more in Loudon's sense than in Kuhn's sense. Radical views of cognitions bring conceptual and theoretical innovations that are sufficiently significant and challenging for computations to care about them. In this sense, enactivists, for instance, are right to claim that they are the actors of a contemporary scientific revolutions. Still, the significance of this revolution does not need to lie in the fact that enactivism or another radical view would replace computationalism, but in the fact that enactivism, on another view, become a serious contender in the field. So, of course, then we should try to find a name for this new research tradition. This is not a task I find very relevant and that I will not try to achieve here. But it is more interesting, I think, to note that for Loudon, speaking about research traditions also allows to put the emphasis on the continuities between the various theories which belong to the research tradition, and from which we can define the moving identity of this research tradition. Take for instance, authors in psychology of philosophy from the past, like James, Dewey, Mead, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, Piaget, Wittgenstein, and so on. Well, there are of theories in philosophy like pragmatism, phenomenology, ecological psychology, or cybernetics. Positive references to these authors and programs abound in the writings of various authors in radical views of cognition. It is important, I think, to note and to understand this intellectual legacy and thus the historical thickness of radical views of cognitions. In some sense, the new research tradition in cognitive science is the development into cognitive science of a venerable and very large intellectual research traditions, going from Protagoras to Hubert Dreyfus or Charles Taylor, via Thomas Reid, Nietzsche, pragmatism, Heidegger. On many issues, these philosophers and systems are different, but they also share identical commitments, some of them defining a tradition. And I think that here it is possible to define this tradition as being in opposition to intellectualism, which is another tradition. According to, and this is, I will end my talk with this, according to intellectualism, the primary relation between living organisms and their environment is a matter of intellect and knowledge. The basic forms of knowledge from which any other forms of knowledge are derived are propositional and contentful. They aim at objectivity. and it is possible to exhaustively describe in terms of propositions and rules the structure which underlie the primary relation between organism and this environment. Representationalism and vehicle internalism, I believe, as they figure in the computational theory of cognition, are just consequences of these intellectualist commitments. Once these commitments are joined with philosophical naturalism and the idea to provide a mechanistic study of cognition. And beneath vehicle externalism and beneath the rejection of representation, the metaphysical and methodological views of radical views of cognition are explicitly anti-intellectualist. If this interpretation is right, then cognitive science is a new scene today on which the opposition between intellectualism and anti-intellectualism is enacted again in virtue of the recent appearance of radical views of cognition as exemplifying and partially constituting a new research tradition competing with another research tradition. And so this will be my conclusion. When radical views of cognition define themselves as being revolutionary, invoking the Kuhnian concept of paradigm shift in crisis, they probably set the bar too high, ignoring all that a scientific revolution requires and not only implies. They look forward to the outcome of a scientific revolution, that is, replacing a classical paradigm by a new one, but underestimate the requirements that may foster a scientific revolution according to Kuhn's theory of science. It might be wiser for radical views to define themselves as revolutionary views of cognition without using Kuhn's vocabulary. Laudan's theory of research traditions is a good alternative, inviting us to embrace the possibility that at the same time, different research traditions compete in cognitive science. So I end here. Thank you.
Thanks, Pierre, for this very interesting talk. So let's move on immediately to Celso's comments. Celso, very nice to see you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure. Can I share my screen? I have some slides. Yes. Perfect. Yeah, can you all see and hear me well? Perfect. So thank you very much for having me. And I would like to thank Pierre for the opportunity to read this paper. Really interesting. And I must say, out of the gate, that I'm really sympathetic to what I take to be the two central claims of the paper, right? So the first one, this sort of moderate, really well-balanced critique of this very first Kuhnian picture of the scientific revolution. So some aspects of the current debate between RVCs and computationalism in cognitive science, they sound Kuhnian, but many aspects do not fit easily into this. So, and then the more positive claim would be that Laudan's theory is more enlightening than Kuhn's for describing this current situation. I think also that I've learned a lot of things with this paper. And I think, first of all, it presents a very vivid example of this, what I take to be the most traditional criticism of Kuhn's view, namely this idea that we always have one universal paradigm in a normal science, right? And this, of course, just applies to the original Kuhn from 1970s. So, but it's a vivid example in cognitive science that I didn't know. So I think, moreover, and probably more interesting to the members of the group, right? The paper presents the complexity of the current situation. So something very interesting about using Laudan here is that we have these two ideas of why it is rational for scientists to pursue theories. So it might be rational because theories are adequate, they have explanatory power, but it might also be rational because the theories are having an increased rate in their progress. So in the beginning, a new research tradition might not explain much, but over time, right, it might increasingly explain more and more, and this in itself is a good reason to pursue a theory. So it's also, using Loudon is really interesting because also we have this framework of theories internal to a research tradition, and this theories might be internal inconsistency. So there is a plasticity of research traditions. This is also very interesting in the paper. And finally, the more positive story in the paper about this parallel history of research traditions that connects to intellectualism. So I find this really fascinating, and I'm really happy to have contact with this. Now, I will just put two basic set of questions for discussion. And here, first of all, the questions are really based more on the paper than on the presentation. Second of all, the questions they speak to my interests, namely is on the history, on the reasons for preferring Loudon over Kuhn. So I'm not going into details about the actual situation of cognitive science because I don't know about that. So I have two sets of questions. One is about the argument, the very method of the paper, like the fact that the paper is using the proclamations or the testimonies of the players in the field, right? And how Pierre is building his arguments on that. The second point connects back to really big discussions in philosophy of science between descriptive and normative goals. So when we use these frameworks of scientific change, we can understand those frameworks in descriptive and normative ways. And this leads us to like new research questions that I would like to pose. Okay, so first of all, about testimony. Here's one, when Pierre is arguing against the Kuhnian interpretation, he poses a dilemma. So he says, on one hand, we can perhaps understand the situation as one, there is no revolution or paradigm shift, but computationalism is in crisis. So maybe that's one possible interpretation of the current situation. The second interpretation would be cognitive science is actually at the stage of pre-science, and as he has shown to us today, he rejects both interpretations. So in the paper, he goes into an argument that he admits is a weak argument, but he nonetheless pursue as a possible way to reject both 1 and 2. And the way he does it is, he says, look, both proponents of RVC and computationalists, both would reject 1 and 2. And therefore, this is a possible reason to reject 1 and 2. Like RVCs wouldn't like to say that there is no revolution or paradigm shift. Computationalists wouldn't like to say that they are in crisis. And none of them would like to say that they are in pre-science moment. So this seems to be a reason to reject. So here he seems to be taking the testimony quite serious. Now, towards the end of the paper, he discusses Loudon's pluralism, the idea that we can have different paradigms, legitimate paradigms. And here's a quotation, right? Some versions of computationalism and some RVC can be on the same side, claiming that their very own views and rival views cannot both live together. So here he's saying, well, some computationalists and RVCs might claim that they disagree with Loudon's pluralism. So they would both repudiate Loudon's pluralism, embracing instead one aspect of Kuhn's theory of science. So, but what Pierre does at this point in the paper is actually not to take the testimony of both sides as seriously as he took before. So he says computationalists might describe cognitive science as monoparadigmatic, but nonetheless, then he goes into investigating the underlying commitments for this testimony, right? And he says the underlying commitments are actually compatible with pluralism, therefore we should embrace pluralism. So there's of course a puzzle, it's not a problem per se, but it's just interesting how in the first example, he's using testimonies to argue against Kuhn's theory. And in the second case, he's investigating those testimonies further, right? Because those testimonies could provide reasons to reject Loudon's, but of course, he doesn't want to reject Loudon's. So I think this just raises a methodological question that permeates the whole paper, right? And as I said, it's not a problem per se, but it's interesting to think about what are the motivations for using or dismissing testimonies, right, of the players in the field. So how we reconstruct the current debate is in part by using those descriptions of the players. So I think the question here is, why does the value of testimonies vary in such circumstances? And when and for what reasons should one use these testimonies as good evidence of the current situation? So of course, I'm not asking him to answer this. This is not a problem for him. I think it's a question about, again, how we reconstruct the current situation. Now, very briefly, a second point, and this really applies, I think, more to the paper, but it's more like an invitation to maybe to further research down the line. So in the abstract, we have the statement of the goal of the paper. So Larry Loudon's theory of research traditions is more enlightening than Kuhn's theory for describing the scope and ambitions of radical views on cognition. So here, the goal seems to be pretty descriptive, right? So it's about how we better understand what these people are doing. Like, what is the best way to describe what they are actually doing, right? So in other words, the conclusion of Pierre's paper would be something like, oh, you RVC's proponents and friends, you should just adopt Larry Loudon's vocabulary because that's a more accurate way to describe what you guys are actually doing. But of course, like the way the conclusion is framed in terms of inviting us to embrace Loudon's pluralism also might suggest that there is an implicit normative goal here. So I think the question, and to explain what I mean, is to ask, we should ask ourselves, why should actually RVC and its proponents define themselves as revolutionary without using Kuhn's vocabulary? What do they gain from it? So perhaps all they gain from it is actually just to be able to describe more accurate what they are doing. I mean, this in itself is a legitimate goal, but perhaps, and here's the normative bit, perhaps RVC should embrace the idea that the best way to conduct science is to be pluralist. So in other words, and by being pluralist, perhaps RVC's proponents will gain something epistemically from it. Perhaps by being pluralists, we can be more progressive with our science, and we can achieve adequacy in the future. So to sum up the discussed questions, again, thank you so much, Pierre, for the paper. And I don't think any of this is actually central to your claims. As I said, I'm very sympathetic to those. Just to summarize, first, why does the value of testimonies vary in such circumstances? And second, what do RVC's proponents gain by becoming pluralists? So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing. I don't know if I should stop sharing. So I will do anyway. I can bring this slide again.
Thanks a lot, Celso. I'll give the word back to Pierre for his replies, and then we go for questions and comments. So if you have a question, please let us know in the chat.
Okay. Well, Celso, I never had the chance to meet you personally, but well, I'm very, very happy and I'm very grateful for your reading so carefully my paper, and for your comment, which, well, as you said, indeed, well, doesn't, I mean, is sympathetic to my paper, but still the issues that you are raising, I think, are very challenging and especially inspiring for me, and maybe for the discussion as well. So first, thank you very much for having read and for having commented the paper this way. So I will try to answer to your two issues in the successive order. First, the question about methodology, as you say, and the importance or not I give to a testimony by being coherent. Well, I will start from the general to the particular. I think that when you describe science, when you describe what scientists do, well, one should not start or arrive to what scientists say they do. Not because everything they say on their activity is wrong or would be full of ideology, no, but because I think their sayings are different from their doings. And this is the case for, I think, almost every human activity. And this is, I mean, the human actors are not very good experts on their own activity. So nevertheless, as you truly remark, I endorse the importance of testimony in some cases in my paper. For instance, I consider that the fact proponents of computation do not experience a state of crisis to be a good reason for rejecting the claim that there would be a crisis in computation. To put it otherwise, for Kuhn, it is constitutive of a crisis to be lived or to be undergone as a crisis by its actors, whereas it is not constitutive of a revolution to be lived as such when it occurs. So for some terms, for Kuhn, you need to take into account the testimony of the actors themselves, like, for instance, in the case of a crisis. Now, if I can go narrow my focus on the reaction of proponents of RVC and computation concerning the use of Kuhn, and you very well summarized the dilemma I am proposing. What I try to show is that the real Kuhn is actually very different from the Kuhn proponents of RVC mean or use. And since there is a tension, I think it's a reason for proponents of RVC to be suspicious about the use of Kuhn. Not because Kuhn's theory goes against their opinion, but because they use Kuhn for saying something which is totally opposite to what Kuhn really says in himself. So there is, an ambiguity. There is, on the one hand, proponents of heresy, they want to use Kuhn. They say they are Kuhnian. But on the other hand, well, I don't think they read or they use Kuhn correctly. So, of course, in this situation, I think it's a good reason for saying that, well, you pretend to be Kuhnian, but basically Kuhn doesn't say what you think he says. So now it's a good reason, well, to be more careful regarding your use. So there is an ambiguity because we arrive the same author, namely Kuhn, is used twice for saying different things. And so in this case, this is what I think, well, it's important to take into account, well, what proponents of heresy want to do about Kuhn, and saying that, well, what they want to do, their objective, their aims, is in contradiction with the real text of Kuhn. Whereas in the second case, concerning Loden this time, and the reason that some proponents of computations and some proponents of heresy might reject Kuhn, I don't take this possible testimony seriously, because basically I've never read any of these proponents claiming he was endorsing Loden, So in this case, even if Loden's theory goes against the possible prejudices or testimonies, this is not a reason for rejecting the Loden's theory or for taking the point of view of the actors into account, since the actors do not pretend to use Loden, whereas in the first case, Enactivists, for instance, they claim to be using or to refer to Kuhn. So, the two situations, I think, are somewhat different. And so this is why I use testimony differently in both cases. But I insist, nevertheless, even if myself, I do not like to use testimonies, if I want to check whether a situation corresponds to Kuhn, well, for some concepts like crisis or revolutions for Kuhn, you need to take into account what the people in the field they live, what they experience. So this is my reply to your first questions. Now, your second question is very challenging here too, concerning the distinction between the descriptive and the normative. Well, you're right. The description should be kept in mind, and we should be very careful about how we want to use it for defining here the aim of my paper. But of course, it's always tricky to use it in a dualist way when you want to understand science, because you can find accounts of science which are very normative, but then they are too normative, they are too separated from the real scientific practices. This is, for instance, the case of Karl Popper's theory of science. Or you can have very descriptive account of science like Kuhn's, but they somehow hide they hide some normativity. This is a point that, for instance, Paul Feyerabend made a criticism of Kuhn on this idea. Kuhn pretends to say how history is going, but in fact is proposing a normative view of what good science should be. Now, and indeed, my paper is both normative and descriptive in this way. There are cases in which I'm descriptive, other cases in which, especially at the end of the paper, and this is something you very correctly mentioned, I am more normative in the defense of pluralism. Well, the idea is that radical views of cognitions should be pluralistic about competing research traditions if they want to be called revolutionary. Indeed, the best models of revolution, I claim, that fits to the situations is Loden's model, and this model is pluralistic. I do not claim in an absolute way that radical views should be pluralistic. What I claim is, if they want to claim or if they want to pretend they are revolutionary, well, they should not invoke Kuhn, but they should better refer to Loden. But I do not claim that in general, well, cognitive science or radical views should be pluralistic. Nevertheless, your questions made me think about this idea. And you're right, in an absolute way. One might think that adopting, endorsing a kind of broad view which defends the idea that there should be different theories in science can have epistemic virtues. For instance, you can say that, well, if you defend the existence of different theories, well, you can encourage the fact that there are confrontations, there are arguments, and that from those debates, scientific progress and truth can arise. But personally, I'm quite skeptical to the possibility that there might be, real discussions between people endorsing different research traditions. Because of course, for this, you need common agreements, but I do not see them in those research traditions. But also the fact that you can accept, or that you say that one should be pluralistic in the science, can also mean that you do not spend too much time arguing against a theory, hoping the defeat of your opponent. You just think forward. You accept that people think otherwise, but you do not care that much about them. You do not consider that you have to fight against them in order to make some progress. And I think to end this, that the question of pluralism can also be related to the complexity of cognition itself. That is, one can argue that if we are real externalists about cognition, if we really want to claim that cognition is embodied, situated, technical, and so on, well, this implies that one should be pluralistic in the kinds of explanation one can have of cognition. If cognition has different levels of existence, well, maybe you need different kinds of theories for explaining all these levels. The idea is not to say, like Andy Clark, that we will need a big synthesis, a big theory encompassing all the theories. I don't think it is working, but I think that you can defend pluralism because the object itself, namely cognition, is especially complex. And so, in this sense, well, pluralism about cognitive science might be, but this is something, of course, to be investigated, a consequence of having a pluralistic approach in the definition of what cognition is. But of course, the idea is that, well, how much with this view can you still keep the idea that some parts of cognition should receive a treatment according to the computational theory of cognition? This is, of course, a problem. If you consider this idea, well, it's not a good picture of cognition, broadly speaking, or from a part of cognition. So I'm here for the reply. I hope I replied to some parts of your comments, but once again, thank you very much for those comments, Celso.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pierre. Celso, do you want to follow up, or should we move on to questions?
We can move on. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that, yeah, I really pose those questions as invitations for more for future research than for actually challenging your premises that I'm sympathetic to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, Celso, thank you. So let's move on to questions. If you have a question, you can raise your hand or let us know in the chat. Eros had to leave. He has a comment for Pierre. Pierre, if you can check it, please. It's not a question. I think it's just a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just reading Eros' comment, which is very, very interesting. And indeed, I think the key point is that if we define research traditions in terms of intellectualism versus anti-intellectualism, a problem might be that those notions are not very used and familiar for the people working in the field, in the disciplines. Well, indeed, but then the question is, when you want to describe a scientific tradition from the outside, do you have to take into account the way the people themselves understand your words? I mean, it's again a question of methodology, and it's related to the question of the testimony, which Celso mentioned.
Questions, anyone? Carlos has a question. Please, Carlos.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. I had problems with my microphone, so I wasn't sure. Actually, I would like to ask just a brief clarification. Since you're familiar with...
Carlos, I can hear you, but
it's very low. Yeah.
It's better now, yeah. No, that was Pierre. It's really low.
Just a sec, please.
Okay. Marco Aurelio has a question. Maybe, Marco, you should make your question, then we move back to Carlos. Is that okay?
Well, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. First, I want to thank you for the presentation. That was very interesting, really, the paper and the presentation. In general, I think I agree with you. I think this revolutionary way of putting how this radical views in cog science is somehow misleading, and it's a misuse of Kuhn. It is just a wrong way, actually, of describing what's going on. I think it is certainly some sort of a pre-scientific situation we are dealing with. It's not exactly crisis, definitely not a revolution. I mean, maybe that's the way the radicalists will like to put it, right? Because they are on their way to the revolution, right? I think that's at least controversial at this point. So we need to, we are clearly, I mean, going back to this pre-scientific status in which we are just kind of holding different views, and the communication or exchange between these groups are becoming more and more difficult. That's how I feel it. And so overall, I agree. And I enjoyed very much Celso's comments. By the way, it's good to see you, Celso, even if only remotely, right? And I have just one point about this very, at the end of the paper, you talk about this, you identify what was once maybe the paradigm in cog science, which was computationalism, with some sort of a intellectualist philosophical sort of a position, right? So you identify that with some sort of intellectualism. And of course, it was a very, it was some sort of a speculation at the end, a certain a digression. You just kind of allowed yourself to, you know, get some free thinking at the end. I understand the status of it. It's still, I think that, I mean, you identify yourself as a radical, and I think I am one of those old-fashioned computationalist guys, I guess. And I think that a lot of the debate that has been going on for a while now has to do with how we are going to understand computation to start with, and what actually falls within this, you know, concept. What can count as a, you know, a computational model, and what not. And I think that a lot of people discuss, you know, all the evolution in computer science and computational models, going from, you know, this serial, very simple, symbolic manipulating systems back, you know, in the old Turing machines, and how it evolved to, you know, connectionism and parallel processing and all that. And all falls within this overall concept of computation. And a lot of the you know, so-called revolutions in this field, for instance, connectionism, they were actually not really that different from the old-fashioned notion of computation. It's just a different design, architecture, you know, it's still a machine, computer, in a sense. And a lot of people defending people like me, right, defending this old-fashioned computational model. We defend that the notion of computation is not really being challenged by this. And I think that the core of of cognitive science, of this research project, since the very beginning, was just to embrace the computational theory of the mind. And that's it. And where it's going to go. Of course, now we're going to have to evolve and develop a lot of different theories and strategies for explaining what sort of computation it is. But still, that's the very core of it. And to identify that with intellectualism seems to be another mistake of the same kind. It's identifying computation with a Turing machine, identifying with serial processing, identifying with whatever. I mean, there is nothing in computation that asks for an intellectual view of cognition, at least not as far as I can see. So maybe you are just repeating the same kind of a mistake. And I mean, probably we are talking past each other because we are in a pre-scientific scenario and you are in the other camp. So maybe that's what's going on. But I mean, that's my feel that that's not a nice way of putting it, to call it an intellectualist position. But that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your remarks, and especially your question, Marco. Well, that will allow me to make things, I hope, clearer. I think there are three distinct things we should distinguish. There is first the project of intellectualism. Secondly, there is the concept of computation. And finally, there is the theory of computation as applied to cognition. I consider that the computational theory of cognition is a version of intellectualism. So it's a way of being intellectualist by using the concept of computation for explaining, describing, modelizing the workings of the mind. But this concept of computation is not exclusive, is not the property, so to say, of the computational theory of cognition. That is, many people can use it, you know, in engineering without having any commitments towards, you know, the way the mind is working. But so what really, to go back to the differences, I do not make an identity between intellectualism and the theory of computation. Once again, the theory of computation is a version of intellectualism, which is characterized by the use of the concept of computation for, so to say, giving a mechanistic explanation. Well, they attempt to give an explanation of the way, well, the mind as a repository of knowledge and representations is working. So I try to keep the three elements distinct, and I hope this can somehow clarify my position as regards your question.
Yeah, no, it does clarify. Just one point. It's just because I think that one important discussion in this field has to do with Fodor's theory, for instance. Fodor, he connects computationalism with a very specific notion of what counts as input to this sort of a computation process, which is the symbols he defines. And so he plugs into the old computational framework a certain representational theory of the mind. Of course, you are not obliged to do that. If you take this as what cog science is all about, I think you have some sort of a you're probably right to identify that with an overall intellectualist stance. Otherwise, I think it's open to intellectualist and anti-intellectualist positions, even if you still are, let's say, following the core notion, or the very core notion of the minds as computing machines, which was in the very origin of cog science. So that's my position. I think that is, again, it's a criticism of something that is just a specific view in the field. it's very much Fodor's view, but I mean, there are more options.
You're right. I understand your points, and I agree. And I must say that in my paper, I'm using Fodor as a friend in the following sense: the idea that nowadays in cognitive science there is a big opposition between intellectualism and anti-intellectualism is an idea which was expressed and shared, by Fodor. So I quite rely on him, but where you're right, and I think it should be said, is that even if one says there is an important opposition in cognitive science between today those two theories, that does not exhaust all the possibilities of understanding cognition and using the concept of computation. And you're right, you can perfectly, logically, and factually have theories of cognitions which are using the concept of computation, but without being either intellectualist or non-intellectualist. That is, there are other places or other possible places in the field. On this, I agree with you. You're right, and it's important to say it, because otherwise you give the misleading impression that I would say that, well, in consent today, either you are intellectualist or you are non-intellectualist. No, of course, there's a way to overcome the debate. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. So let's go back to Carlos.
Can you hear me now? Is it
Yeah.
better? Okay, thank you. First of all, thanks a lot for your talk. It was very elucidating. And I'd love to read the paper whenever it's available. Well, my question actually has a lot to do with Marco's comments. Actually, he made me formulate another one. So now I have two questions, though you might have already answered that partially. First, if I got it right, you have suggested that we can understand more radical views of cognition as a rejection of intellectualism. I'm not sure what to think of, for instance, Andy Clark's position. And what I have in mind is more the Andy Clark from Being There than the Andy Clark from Surfing Uncertainty. In a way, his position is not radical, neither classic, but it can be taken, I think, as a rejection of intellectualism. This is way more salient in Being There than in Surfing Uncertainty. He accepts a pluralism about the kind of explanation that a cognitive system should allow. So the first question is, are radical views not so radical, or are Andy Clark's views more radical than we might think they are? And the second point is about the way computationalism gets into the conversation. As Marco, I also believe that it's not clear to me whether we should identify computational explanations with some kind of intellectualist position. We have, for instance, mechanistic conceptions of computations, such as the one from Piccinini. I'm not sure if you're probably familiar with, but they are not essentially related to any kind of semantic conception of computation, such as the one used by Fodor and others. So we might have computational explanations which are not exactly, they're not symbolic, there might not be representational in any way. So, well, that's the point. How would that fit in the framework you're suggesting? You see, this is complementary to what Marco has said. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carlos. Well, for your second question, well, indeed, it is related to what Marco asked some minutes ago, and I would reply the same way. Indeed, making the distinction, saying that the distinction between intellectualism and anti-intellectualism is a clarifying oppositions for understanding radical views of cognition does not imply that I say this is the only way to do cognitive science. And but you're very right, you and Marco, to insist on this. Indeed, there are other ways to understand cognition using computation without endorsing the debate. And indeed, those views of computation as being a very ubiquitous phenomenon, which is not related to semantic content, to representations, and so on, except in a very formal sense, indeed, is something that I should pay attention when I define, the field and the position. So this is for your second question. Now the second question regarding Andy Clark. Well, you're very right, and he's, I mean, well, he's a very important author, very interesting, very inspiring, but also very interesting to study if one wants to understand the evolution of cognitive science. If you take, indeed, if you take the book Being There by Clark, I think it was in 1996. At that time, this was one of the most revolutionary book in cognitive science. Well, there was 3 years before, there was the book The Embodied Mind by Varela, Thompson, and Roche, and Clark is in Being There, is using them. He says, I agree with them, except on the concept of representation. He said that, well, for me, there is still a place we can give to the concept of representation, but otherwise, they are very right to insist on the importance of the intermingling between the body, the brain, and the world. Then, of course, what is very interesting is that whereas Clark could seem to be radical in 1996, he was very quickly overcome by much more radical positions, which today say that, well, Clark is not radical at all. He's very classical. This is the classical strategy, for instance, by Uto and Main. When they say radical anti-enactivism, they say we should be much more radical than those people. And for Uto and Main, the big problem is that, well, those people like Clark, for instance, or even sometimes Varela, well, they are still tolerant. They still keep the concept of mental representations, which is a big mistake, and we should go well beyond it. So I think depending on the timing you're using, but also the comparison you make, Clark may sometimes seem to be very radical. For instance, if you compare Andy Clark to Jerry Fodor, but if you make other comparisons between Andy Clark and Uto Main, well, Clark seems very classical, very conservative, and moreover, if you consider what Clark has written on predictive processing, it is still much more relevant. But still, he has always defined, the importance of having a pluralistic point of view on cognitive science. And what is very interesting is that for Clark, and this is something he explains at the end of this predictive processing book, Surfing Uncertainty, he says that, well, the only way to be somehow pluralistic and to make the articulation between the different explanations of cognition, embodied, computational, and so on, well, is maybe using the concept of mental representation. Maybe it is still the key concept, allowing us to understand how the mind can as it is, always interacting with the environment. But once again, I mean, Clark is a very interesting figure, to understand the evolution of the field.
That's great. Just one small clarification. So would you say, for instance, that someone who commits to a representational view of the mind, and I'm not claiming, not necessarily symbolic, not necessarily propositional. You may think of something like, I don't know, some isomorphic conceptions such as Robert Cummings or something like that. Would that conception be intellectualist in your view?
Well, to be brief but clear, yes, definitely. I mean, but this is related to my pragmatist commitments. But I mean, I'm very skeptical and critical towards the idea of content, of mental content, and the idea of mental representation. And indeed, whether you use a symbolic view, a sub-symbolic view, an isomorphic view, or a mental picture view, for me, those are all in the same family. They are representationalists. Of course, they have many differences between them. I do not deny this, and they are very important. But still, they belong to me, to intellectualism. This is the dream. For me, it's a dream. It's the idea that there would be some parts of matter in nature which would by themselves be able to have content. And for me and other people, well, this is an impossible dream. But I can totally understand that you might disagree.
No, okay. Just trying to make clear what's your position. That's great. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. no one else has a question, I have a question, Pierre, about, I wanted to hear more about why you reject the pessimistic view that you're basically going back to a pre-science moment in cognitive science, because I think from the point of view of people working on the traditional, broadly construed computationalist view, what happens is we had this groundbreaking work such as limits of thought and modularity of mind, and then the tradition, they cease to worry about the big questions, right? So if you talk to someone working within the cognitive psychology and running experiments, maybe young people have never read Fodor, maybe they don't even know exactly who Fodor is, but they talk about mental representations. They're running experiments, the experiments are working, they're getting results, and that's just normal science, right? So radical views of cognition as a new position is going back to the big picture. So you have titles like Mind in Life and things like that. Right? I think that's unthinkable for us to have now a book about everything within the field of cognitive psychology, for instance. And so if radicalists like yourself are successful in bringing us back to the big picture and to the big questions, isn't the result likely that we're actually going back to a moment of pre-science, just trying to understand what we're talking about? What does mind actually mean? What does life actually mean? What does body actually mean? And so why should a radicalist not share the view that maybe we have to go back to a pre-science moment, so then it can give a step forward to a new moment of normal radical embodied science, cognitive science?
Yeah, well, thank you, Andres. It's very, very interesting and difficult question. Well, I can answer it two ways. I can answer very quickly from a very pragmatic point of view. In the paper and in my presentation, I do not consider further that view because, well, proponents of radical views would not accept it. And well, when I speak about proponents, this time I do not include myself in them. That is, most of them. And if you take, I mean, if you take Gallagher, if you take Yuto and mine or Kimiro, well, there is the idea that no, there is cognitive science, and cognitive science should continue its work, its production of papers, of research, of grants, and so on. And so there is no reason, you know, to go back at the level of pre-science. That would be too dangerous for the seriousness of the field. For instance, if you want to encourage, you know, the fact that cognitive science is taught in universities or is receiving fundings from states and industries and so on. Well, if you say it's a pre-science, well, this is not a very good way, you know, to present what you're doing. So in a very pragmatic way, it would be very bad for the picture of the science that people saying that, well, no, it goes back to pre-science. But then, of course, there is a challenge, which is if there is still the science, but the paradigm is changing, what is staying constant? What is staying the same? Of course, if you say that what is staying the same is the project of understanding the mind, this is much too vague, you know. I mean, this is not strong enough. So of course you need, you know, at least minimal commitments which are shared by all the parties in the field, and this is a problem. But I think now the situation we have today is too soon or too early, you know, for addressing this question. Maybe it's a question that historians in the future might have, because of course here too the normative and the descriptive mix. That is, if I say, well, it is fundamental for cognitive science to keep, you know, basic commitments and methods, well, I describe something, but I also say this is what people have to do, should do, if they want to claim they do cognitive science. So this is the pragmatic answer. The bigger answer, you know, is to say that, well, indeed, you can also, and this is something that Nunes is doing in his paper, which is very changing, is to say that, well, still cognitive science is dead. I mean, there has been this project of making, you know, a science with many disciplines of the mind. You know, this is the classical picture of a star with 5 branches, each branch representing linguistic, psychology, neuroscience, AI. But this picture was intelligible during 40 years, which is a very short time if we reason in terms of history of science. But nowadays, there are too many complexities. There is an increasing specialization of each field so that someone could be competent, you know, in both neuroscience and psychology, for instance. So for them, no, we should give up this idea of cognitive science in the singular. No, it can be cognitive sciences in the plural. But no, of course, this brings again the idea of the unity. If there is no unity of this science in the singular, should there be some unity in the plural? Well, this is another question. But to go back to your own considerations, and I totally agree with them. If one puts emphasis on the importance of the body, of the living, when you define cognition, well, at least this is raising new issues on how to define life and the body again when you claim that cognition is live or is embodied. So those are new foundational questions, and there are many disagreements between proponents of radical views themselves. Okay, for instance, if you compare, you know, autopoietic enactivism with radical enactivism, well, they have very, very different commitments and ambitions. So, you know, so if radical views, there are views in the plural, but here too, we should be careful, and I should be careful, I have to admit, not, you know, to make as if they were speaking with the same voice, with only one voice.
Great, yeah, thanks. We have a few minutes left for one further question. Who wants to ask it? If not, let's thank Pierre once again for a great presentation, a great paper. I really enjoyed it. Really neat.
Thank you to all of you. It was a pleasure and very inspiring for me.
Thank Pierre. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks, Celso. Also hope to see you again soon. So, Felipe, would you like to say a few words as this is our last meeting of the year?
Yeah, just know that as it's being recorded, just to make clear, so this is our last meeting of the year. So we'll probably resume soon in January, perhaps in February, we'll still discuss it internally. But thanks everybody, and this talk will be soon online, both on our website and on the YouTube channel. And thanks everybody for